I'm not finding anything in the instructions, so here's my proposal. Mr. Cayer is elected not to be transported to today's hearing and has decided therefore not to appear at or participate in phase 2 of the trial.
I don't have a problem with that.
Any concern, Mr. Lassay, or do you want it revised in any way? I'm sorry?
I have concerns because I have concerns with an unusual situation.
We are off, but let's go on the record. All right, we're going to go back on the record. We called the case earlier this morning, State of Wisconsin versus Jacob Cayer, 16 CF 902. Mr. Lassay is present in the courtroom. Mr. Johnson is walking into the courtroom, and Ms. Petrus is in the courtroom as well on behalf of the state. And Mr. Cayer is not present. His attorneys, Mr. Eichhoff and Mr. Cotton, are present. We are discussing what, if anything, to tell the jury about the fact that Mr. Cayer is not present today. We cannot find any kind of a standard instruction in a criminal case that might be applicable. We all took a few minutes to look. I have a law clerk looking as well, but I just don't find one. I looked through the entire table of contents. Mr. Eichhoff did a number of searches electronically as well. So one of the proposals is Mr. Cayer has elected not to be transported to today's hearing and therefore has decided not to appear at or participate in phase 2 of the trial. Mr. Cotton indicated off the record he didn't have a problem with that instruction. Mr. Lassay, is that correct, Mr. Cotton?
Yes.
Mr. Lassay, what's your position?
And I don't have any problem with the instruction. It's just obviously a very unique situation. I'm attempting to look into it and sent out a message statewide to the prosecutor Unibrain to see if we can get any advice on that as well. So certainly there's nothing inappropriate about the instruction that the court is intending to read, and if there are additional things that we think need to be read, I think that could be done in a later time, as long as at least at this point we're informing them why he's not here.
Right. Let's then proceed with our discussion about the jury instructions. Now, I just want you to know, when I looked at instruction 603, I thought it was odd that it didn't really explain things very well. So I added in paragraph 3 and 4. I want you to look at that closely and make sure you're comfortable with that. It's quite duplicitous, and so I wouldn't need to read both paragraphs, but I just want to make sure that you understand that that's language I added. In fact, I'm going to pull it up just to make sure that I'm not misspeaking. I'm going to pull up the actual standard instruction. Yes, I added those. So if you don't want them, it's not going to hurt my feelings. Tell me what you want to do in that regard. I don't typically like to make a lot of revisions to jury instructions. I think we have pattern instructions for a reason. So either way, I'm fine with reading it whatever way you'd like it to be presented.
Judge, can you tell me what number that jury instruction is again?
603. Do you have the copy I gave you yesterday, or would you like me to print it again?
Yes, we have it.
We got it. Good.
She says 603.
want all of them?
I think we got the.
That's all right. I have to pull it up, and for some reason, it's not pulling up. That would be my luck. It's like I don't have connection to my document. Oh, here we go. We looked into using them, but they said it wasn't a good idea, even though they bought disinfectant and stuff.
I think maybe that's either.
I don't know. I can't believe they are. They don't look like they're very. They look kind of handmade, don't they?
Yeah. I think he went in the back.
Well, we tried to get the garbage out if we wanted. So there's one that was just normal. It was like garbage. Sure.
I have found it. Oh, but great. You got one I have. How many pages is it?
I can just delete those two paragraphs if you want to use the standard instruction.
Honestly, I'm fine either way. They are a little bit redundant potentially, but I do like some of the additional. I agree.
Should we just make it one paragraph? I'm sorry?
I just agree that it kind of jumps into. Perhaps use the third.
That's what I was thinking. Are you okay with that?
What's your proposal?
So where it says it is the law in this state, leave that in, but take out the next one after hearing the evidence, because it basically repeats itself.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go on the record. What are we on the record? We'll go back on the record. We've agreed to add in one paragraph to instruction 603, explaining a little bit more about what the law is. It's a brief paragraph. It is the law in this state that a person is not responsible for his criminal conduct if, at the time of such conduct, he had a mental disease as a result of which he lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. You will hear evidence on this issue. That's the agreement to add that into instruction 603, Mr. Lassay. Mr. Cotton?
That's fine.
All right. Now, I was also planning to explain to them that at this phase, the burden switches, that because now the defense has the burden, they'll make their opening first, call witnesses first, closing arguments first, and then tell them that they can also take notes, but not during opening and closing. Any objection to that?
No.
All right. And both sides intend to make an opening statement, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. I think I'm going to explain to them what we just decided with regard to Mr. Cayer not being present today first, so they
Yes.
hear that right away.
Yes.
Okay. And then can I ask you to disconnect from Zoom so that in the event anyone wants to use the projector, and then we'll just reconnect when it's time?
You mean for opening statement?
Yes, for openings or whatever might happen while I read instructions.
He doesn't have to be, I just have to unplug you.
Okay. Then we'll just unplug my computer and plug mine back in. The clerk is telling me that's all we have to do. All right. You can close mine even. All right, thank you. All right, are we ready for the jury to be brought in?
Yes.
All right, please stand for the jury.
It just ended. Can you email Ken and just tell him? You got the email, should I? Yeah.
After opening. Please be seated. The jury has returned to the courtroom. Court is back in session. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your prompt appearance here today. We had a couple of issues to address, so we'll get going right away. Mr. Cayer has elected not to be transported to today's hearing and therefore has decided not to appear at or participate in Phase 2 of the trial. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant has been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, attempted first-degree intentional homicide, burglary, and 2 counts of bail jumping. We will now proceed with the second phase of this trial. The defendant has entered a plea that he is not responsible for his criminal conduct by reason of mental disease or defect. During the second phase, you will be asked to determine whether the defendant is not responsible by reason of mental disease or defect. It is the law in this state that a person is not responsible for his criminal conduct if, at the time of such conduct, he had a mental disease or defect, as a result of which he lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. You will hear evidence on this issue today. Before you may find that the defendant is not responsible for his criminal conduct, the defendant must satisfy you to a reasonable certainty by the greater weight of the credible evidence that at the time the crime was committed, the defendant had a mental disease or defect and as a result lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of the conduct or to conform that conduct to the requirements of law. That issue will be presented to you in the form of 2 questions. First, at the time the crime was committed, did the defendant have a mental disease or defect? And second, as a result of the mental disease or defect, did the defendant lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law? You will be asked to answer the second question only if you answer the first question, yes. If you find that the defendant is not responsible for his criminal conduct, the defendant will be committed to the custody of the Department of Health Services and will be placed in an appropriate institution unless the court determines that the defendant would not pose a danger to himself or others if released under conditions ordered by the court. The only issue at this second phase of the trial is the defendant's mental condition at the time of the offense. This is a defense, which means the burden of proof now shifts to the defendant. You will recall that at the beginning of this trial in Phase 1, I instructed you about who has that burden of proof. This process is now essentially reversed and the burden shifts to the defendant. In this phase, because the defense has the burden of proof, They will make their opening statement first, they will call witnesses first, and they will make their closing argument first. Ladies and gentlemen, just like in Phase 1, you are permitted to take notes. As I told you before, you are not required to, but you may take notes during this phase of the trial, except during the opening statements and closing arguments. The court will provide you with materials. I remind you again that in taking notes, you must be careful that it does not distract you from carefully listening to and observing the witnesses. You may rely on your notes to refresh your memory during your deliberations. Otherwise, keep them confidential. After the second phase of the trial, the notes will be collected and destroyed. We will begin momentarily with opening arguments. Is there a need to approach?
No.
Okay. At this stage of the proceedings, ladies and gentlemen, both lawyers have the opportunity to make an opening statement for Phase 2 of the trial. The purpose of an opening statement is to outline for you what each side expects to prove so that you will better understand the evidence as it is introduced during the trial. I must caution you, however, that opening statements are not evidence. After counsel have completed their opening statements, we'll begin this portion of the trial with Attorney Cotton calling his first witness. Mr. Cotton, would you like to make your opening statement at this time?
Yes, please. Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? I first wanted to address the elephant in the room, of course, and that's the fact that Mr. Cayer isn't here. The judge read you the instruction on that. He's declined to be transported, if you will, and so you won't have him present for this stage of the proceedings. As the judge indicated, this is the second phase of the trial, and when I stood up here or sat in front of you when we first began this process on Friday, we had asked that everybody pay very close attention to the evidence because we expected on our end that we would get to this phase. Now that we're here, now that you've reached your findings yesterday, it's our burden of proof, as the judge told you, to produce evidence to show that Mr. Cayer was suffering from a mental illness at the time that he committed these crimes. You sat through many days of testimony, hearing various witnesses that the state called. You were able to hear some audio clips. You were able to see some video clips. You heard from Mr. Cayer yesterday, too. And I think, quite honestly, when all of you went out to deliberate, I don't imagine there was a tremendous amount of debate amongst you guys about what happened in this case. I know that not just because the verdict came back so quickly, but because we all sat through the same trial and certainly heard all the evidence that we had. Now I think what you're going to hear in this phase of the trial is that Mr. Cayer is profoundly mentally ill. He's a very sick individual. My witness that I will be calling today is a doctor out of Madison. He's going to be appearing by video today for all of you. He has some concerns about COVID because of his work in the medical profession, but he's going to be here by video in a live format where we're going to ask him questions and you're going to be able to hear from him directly. His name is Dr. Ken Robbins, and Dr. Robbins has been around for a long time. He's an incredibly experienced doctor. He's a board-certified psychiatrist. He's also board-certified in internal medicine. He has, in my opinion, his credentials are impeccable. You'll learn that ultimately Dr. Robbins was hired by the district attorney's office to provide an evaluation of Mr. Cayer. We had entered a plea that's called not guilty by reason of insanity or not reason of mental disease or defect. When we entered that plea, the district attorney's office they chose this doctor and they hired him to do an evaluation of all of the evidence in this case. And ultimately, the judge approved that appointment, and he produced a rather thorough report examining all of the police reports, all of the video. He interviewed Mr. Cayer. He examined Mr. Cayer's very extensive mental health history. You can see here in front of me on the desk we have 2 binders of Mendota records. Those are just a portion of what exists in Mr. Cayer's background in terms of his psychiatric problems. And you're going to learn a little bit more about some of those problems that Mr. Cayer has dealt with and why Dr. Robbins concludes that Mr. Cayer couldn't conform his conduct to the requirements of the law or appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct when he committed these crimes. We think Dr. Robbins' conclusions are just what we would expect in a criminal case. We expect that a doctor will do a thorough job. We expect that they'll study all available evidence, and we expect that they'll produce a fair and impartial opinion. He did all of that in this case, and I think you'll be impressed with the quality of his work. We may show some video clips also to give you a better clips that we didn't show you during the guilt phase, because frankly, I don't think the clips have a whole lot of bearing on the issue of whether Mr. Cayer committed the crime or not. But video clips that are somewhat contemporaneous with the incident that show you how he was functioning, how he was talking, how he was acting, how he was behaving. You're going to see that evidence as well. You will also learn that as part of Dr. Robbins' evaluation, he looked at, well, we all know, of course, that this crime happened in 2016, and we've heard about this throughout the trial, that there has been ongoing evaluations performed against Mr. Cayer over these intervening 4 years, and that Dr. Robbins read a lot of those reports. He's familiar with some of these doctors who've been involved in this case. And what we're trying to do from a defense perspective, because it's our burden of proof here, is we're trying to give you, we're trying to condense this into a format that we think is logical, easy for you to understand, and hopefully not redundant. Our goal here is to give you what we think is the relevant information to help you reach the right decision on this important phase of the trial. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lissay?
I echo Attorney Cotton's advice to you that you should listen carefully and closely to the testimony that you hear today from Dr. Robbins. And just like the defense asked you to do in the first phase, I would also ask you to listen to the lack of information that Dr. Robbins has. So there's a reason why under Wisconsin law that the jury makes a decision about whether somebody qualifies for an NGI plea. You'll hear instruction at the end of the case that the doctor's opinion is an opinion, and it is just that. It is his opinion, but it is for you to decide whether he substantially lacked the capacity to understand the wrongfulness of his conduct or substantially lacked the ability to conform his conduct to Wisconsin law. Dr. Robbins did review a number of things. He does have impeccable credentials. The state doesn't doubt that. In fact, as Attorney Patton indicated, he was initially retained by the state to prepare a report. Obviously, his report supports the defense position in this case, and therefore the defense is calling him as a witness. I don't intend to attack Dr. Robbins' credentials. That's not what this is about. He's a professional doctor, and he does a good job. But he also is not the jury. He didn't hear 3 days of testimony. He didn't have the opportunity to observe Mr. Cayer for nearly as long as you did. You'll find out he did a very brief interview with Mr. Cayer over Zoom. He didn't actually meet with Mr. Cayer in person. Never has. You had the opportunity to observe Mr. Cayer in person here in trial, not just when he testified, but during the 3 days of trial. You were able to observe him more thoroughly than Dr. Robbins ever was. In addition, you were able to observe all of the testimony from all of the witnesses. You know more about this case than Dr. Robbins will know about this case. He will have information about Mr. Cayer's mental health, and that is important. Okay, but the standard isn't, does Mr. Cayer have a mental illness? The standard is, did that mental illness cause him to substantially lack the capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the law? And the facts of this case in 2016 that you heard are what are important to that. So as you're going through the testimony here in phase 2, and as you're showed some clips, and the defense intends to show you some clips, I think the state is likely to show you some clips as well of Mr. Cayer's conduct near 2016. And it's important that you remember that it is what was Mr. Cayer's conduct immediately before and during this action. And did his mental illness cause him to substantially lack that capacity? Not just is he mentally ill now, was he mentally ill then? That's not the standard. Okay? And it is for you to decide. So the state intends to show that Dr. Robbins, while he did an excellent job, didn't have all of the facts and circumstances available to him to consider. He didn't view what you viewed. He didn't see what you saw or hear what you heard. It is for you to make that decision based on all of the information and the facts and the circumstances in this case, and to use your common sense and your judgment, like we asked you to do at the outset in voir dire. I ask you to listen carefully to what he has to say and listen carefully to what both sides present here today, and then ultimately you decide whether the defense has met its burden because the defense now has the burden to show by clear and convincing evidence that in fact Mr. Cayer did substantially lack that capacity to either conform to the law or to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. Thank you.
Thank you. The jury has been provided with note-taking materials. All right, thank you. Mr. Cotton, would you like to call your first witness?
Thank you. We will call Dr. Ken Robbins. And folks, we're going to be doing this by Zoom as I had indicated, so bear with me if we have any technical glitches here. We'll do our best.
Give me a second.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Dr. Robbins, can you hear us?
I can.
So you're calling Dr. Robbins?
We call it Dr. Ken Robbins.
Why is he not on the...
We have it on the speaker camera, so whoever's speaking will be appearing on the screen.
Well, I'd like to see him on the screen at all times. Because the jury can see you, they need to be able to see him at all times as well.
Yes.
The screen's plugged in through your.
Exactly.
Like that, right?
Is there, can you still switch it to just scrolling for everybody else on the side? Where you like split the screen and have him larger? I think it's up in the view.
So my understanding is the speaker view, whoever's speaking will show up. Oh, like this, turn it, switch means.
Yeah, if we can get Mr. Robbins to project in that spot only.
Mr. Robbins will talk, he'll.
Okay, then we'll have to have him smaller because the jury needs to be able to see him at all times when he's a witness. If he were on the stand, they would be able to see him at all times.
Would you like me to make him large at all times?
Yes, if you can accomplish that, that would be best. That's perfect. All right. Dr. Robbins, would you please stand and raise your right hand to be placed under oath?
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in the matter now before the court, so help you God?
All right. If you could respond again, the speaker wasn't on, sir.
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. If you would please state and spell your name for the record.
Kenneth Robbins, Robbins.
Thank you. Mr. Cotton?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Where are you appearing from?
Madison.
And why are you appearing by Zoom today?
Partly because of my age, partly because of difficulties with the schedule, partly because I live with my daughter who's pregnant.
Okay. So fair to say that there's some coronavirus concerns on your end as well?
Correct.
Dr. Robbins, I want to start by showing you a copy of your CV and ask if you can identify that. Can you see this document in front of you?
I can.
Do you recognize that document? This is Exhibit 20, Your Honor.
I do. It's my CV or resume.
All right, I think that can just be reduced and we can return Mr. Robbins to the screen. Thank you.
Dr. Robbins, what's your educational background?
You want me to start with medical school?
Sure.
I went to medical school at University of Michigan, got a master's in public health at University of Michigan following medical school, did residencies in both internal medicine and psychiatry.
Is psychiatry a specialty of yours?
It is.
Do you hold any certifications in psychiatry?
I am board certified in psychiatry.
What does it mean to be a board certified psychiatrist?
It means that you've completed a residency, and at the time that I became board certified, there's a two-part exam that one needs to take, a verbal and a written part.
And are you an internal medicine specialist?
So I did complete a 3-year internal medicine residency and became board certified in internal medicine, but I only practice psychiatry and, to some extent, internal medicine as it relates to psychiatry.
So fair to say that you're a psychiatrist, right?
Yes.
Okay. Are you a treating psychiatrist? Meaning, do you treat individuals with psychotic conditions?
I do.
How long have you been a psychiatrist for, sir?
Well, I finished my residency in 1985.
And at that point, you would consider yourself a psychiatrist once you finish your residency?
Correct. I became board certified a year later, so 95.
Yeah.
So it's 35 years.
About 35 years. Let's walk through, I'm not going to walk through your entire CV. It appears to be 5 pages. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's right.
And you've, looks like you're a published author. Is that true?
I did some publishing when I was younger. I haven't for many years.
And you've given presentations over the years. It looks like quite a few presentations you've given.
I have.
And it looks, if I'm summarizing it correctly, it looks like you've presented on topics in the psychiatric field, it would appear.
Correct. I continue to do that. I'm very involved with the UW psychiatry residency, and so I continue to do a lot of teaching and presentations.
And it looks like you've received many honors in your career. Is that true?
Some, yes. Thank you.
And your current employments, or you wear a few different hats right now, as I understand it. Isn't that true?
It is.
Where are you employed?
So I'm the medical director for mental health for Rock County. I teach at UW. I do some work with the Madison Police Department. I do some work with a Grace Hospice, which is the big hospice in this area. And I do some forensic work.
Your forensic work would be sort of what you did in this case. Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Forensics. What are forensics?
So it's where, if in regard to me, it's where psychiatry and the law intersect, and getting hired by various lawyers or courts to perform evaluations.
And you can be hired by, you're available to be hired by either side, is that correct?
It is.
So sometimes you get hired by prosecutors, sometimes you get hired by defense attorneys?
And sometimes by judges.
Okay. So any of those ways you can get brought into a case?
Correct.
What do you do as the medical director of Rock County?
So each county has a mental health department that is asked to take care of people who either are underinsured or have no insurance or have psychiatric illnesses that are severe enough that they're very hard to follow in a private practice. And so in Rock County we have 8 psychiatrists and we have 3 nurse practitioners. We have a fairly large program, and we work with people primarily who have serious psychiatric illnesses.
So that work is, again, psychiatric type work as a medical director.
Exactly.
And you teach at UW. What do you teach?
So I teach everything from basic clinical psychiatry to psychiatry and the law to psychiatry and internal medicine.
So you're familiar with the interplay between psychiatry and the law as a specific field?
Yes.
As it relates to, so, and just as a point of order, Dr. Robbins, if you have your email open on your computer, could you shut that down, or do you have that open?
Yeah, I don't know how to do that.
Okay.
Maybe I can do that.
Are you worried that's what that
I think
beeping
that's
noise
the beeping
is?
I was hearing in the background.
Yeah, I think I turned it off.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Now, you work with the local police department also. That was something you testified to?
Correct.
And helping with psychiatric evaluations, as I understand it, right?
Correct.
So you provide an opinion to the police department about whether new recruits are of the right psychiatric makeup to be a police officer, fair to say?
So the work with new recruits, so Madison typically hires 35 or 40 new officers each year, and they bring in about 80 after they go through their process. And the chief, the recruiting people, and I interview each of the 80 and then try to figure out who is most appropriate. I wouldn't say it's so much a psychiatric interview as trying to get to know someone behind the mask of who they want to be perceived as.
Got it. You have some experience working through how people present themselves and what the reality might actually be.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to get a real understanding of their values and who they are.
Let's just talk about that for a minute. Is that common? In other words, is that a known phenomenon in psychiatry that somebody might present one way but actually be functioning a different way?
Yes.
What is the Mendota Mental Health Center?
So the Mendota Mental Health Institute is one of 2 state hospitals, Mendota in Madison and the Winnebago Mental Health Institute in Oshkosh. So when I worked at Mendota back in the 90s, it had patients who had everything from kids to adolescents to adults who were sent there involuntarily to people who are there by the sent there by the criminal justice system, either because they were found not guilty by reason of insanity, because they were being evaluated for competency, or they were being treated to try to return them to competency.
Do you have personal experience with Mendota itself?
So I was medical director there for about 8 years in the 1990s.
Okay, the medical director of Mendota.
Correct.
And is that you said that's a state psychiatric facility?
Exactly.
So do people get committed there, or how did the people end up there?
Well, so it was different when I was there than it is now. So when I was there, as I was saying, people could be there civilly, meaning they hadn't committed a crime. They were being sent there involuntarily to be treated because they were mentally ill and dangerous. We also had kids and we had adolescents, and then there were people, adults, who were sent there by the courts because they were found not guilty by reason of insanity, with the understanding that they would be treated at Mendota, or because they needed to be treated to become competent to stand trial, or to be evaluated as to whether they were competent to stand trial.
Let's break both of those things apart. What does it mean to be competent to stand trial?
So it's essentially a 2-part finding. One is that you understand the theater of the courtroom, you understand who plays what part, and what their function is, and you understand what you're being charged with, and what might happen as a result of the court process. And then the second part, which is a little more complex to assess, is whether you have the capacity to assist your lawyer.
Okay, so some people can be found incompetent because they have a problem in either one of those directions.
Exactly.
Then what is, you use the phrase insanity, what is the, are you familiar with the abbreviation NGI?
Yes.
What does NGI abbreviation mean to you?
Well, not guilty by reason of insanity. It's really not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect.
Okay, and what, are you familiar with the criteria for that type of plea?
Yes.
What is the standard as you understand it?
So so each state has their own standard. In Wisconsin, it is that either because of a mental illness you can't differentiate right from wrong, essentially, or that because of a mental illness you're compelled to commit a crime and you don't have the ability to stop yourself.
So a person could suffer on either of those prongs also?
Yes, or both.
Now, I want to talk about this, sort of get into the specifics a little bit here. How, you're aware that this crime dates back to 2016, are you not?
I am.
How did you get involved in this case?
I got a call from the district attorney from Brown County, Mr. Lassie, asking if I would be willing to conduct an evaluation.
So he called you personally?
Correct.
Do you have any idea why you were chosen to do an evaluation? Was that ever communicated to you?
I don't. What he told me in the initial phone call is they were looking for somebody who would be fair, which I have great respect for when people say that they're not, they're not trying to hire a hired gun. They want somebody who's going to do a thoughtful evaluation.
What did you mean by a hired gun?
There are sometimes lawyers who make clear that they're looking for a particular outcome, and certainly that was not what Mr. Lassie suggested.
So that when the district attorney contacted you, it was made very clear that you're not to be a hired gun, right?
That's fair, yes.
That's not something you'd be interested in any event, right?
Correct.
So he wanted you to be fair, and did you agree to take on this assignment?
I did. I agreed with the understanding. So this was right at the beginning of COVID when I first heard from Attorney Lassie. It was, I believe, back in March, and just as all the COVID pandemic was getting started, and it was a little unclear what was happening with courts and how I would interview him. But yes, assuming we could work out the logistics, I agreed to do it.
Okay, and so when they brought you in was when COVID started to sort of hit society.
Exactly.
And did problems develop with having contact with people during that time?
Yes.
Okay. Now, so am I correct that you get paid for your time?
I do.
So the district attorney's office, I'm assuming, agreed to pay you for your work, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you negotiated a agreement with them so that you could do your evaluation?
Yes.
In terms of materials you need to, let me ask you this. Do you think you did a thorough evaluation in this case?
I do.
You would agree that you haven't sat through the jury trial, right?
Correct.
Would that be something that you would normally do as part of an NGI evaluation, come sit through a trial?
No.
Has that ever happened in your career that you just came and sat through a trial for an NGI purpose?
I don't think so.
Okay. So you didn't sit here for a trial. Instead, you did an evaluation based on materials the state provided you.
Mostly, although you had provided me some materials as well.
Okay. So when they hired you in the case, what did you ask them for, or what did they give you?
I asked them for the police reports, any recent evaluations, and I was eventually able to get the medical records from Mendota.
And then, so the district attorney's office provided you with police reports. You said evaluations. Do you mean mental health evaluations?
Various competency, they were primarily competency evaluations.
And then medical records, how did you get those?
I actually got those through Mendota myself.
Because of your connections there?
Well, because I had, because I was appointed. I mean, if once one is appointed by the court to do an evaluation, if you're willing to drive to Mendota, you can look through records.
Okay. And then did you have a chance to review videos in this case?
I did.
And audio files?
I did.
Summaries of hard drives, did you review anything like that?
I did.
Are you a forensic, do you have any forensic experience with computers where you actually examine hard drives?
I don't.
Okay. So why is it important, why did you want to review police reports, sir?
Because I wanted to see the facts from at the time of the arrest. One of the challenges of doing a not guilty by reason of insanity evaluation is that it's dependent on the condition of the accused at the time of the crime. And obviously I'm not interviewing him at the time of the crime, as opposed to a competency evaluation where you're evaluating someone based on how they are in this moment. So with a not guilty by reason of insanity evaluation, it's important to get as much information as you can about what kind of condition he was in at the time of the crime.
And is that part of the reason why you wanted to view videos?
Yes, both police reports and videos, yes.
And I'm assuming same for other types of evidence. It's just important to know as much as possible about how someone was functioning.
Exactly.
And there was information we provided you with. Is there anything specifically you remember that the defense provided you with?
So I'm a little confused about who I got what from, but I think that you provided me with the videos that were taken by the police when they questioned Mr. Cayer in the emergency room primarily.
So what are the steps to doing an NGI evaluation? What did you do once you got all this stuff?
So I read through everything I have, look through what videos I have, and then I do an interview with Mr. Cayer. And again, the question isn't what condition is he in right now. The question is what do I think was happening at the time of the crime? What kind of condition do I think he was in, and does he meet the standard for a not guilty by reason of insanity, and not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect?
Now you did it. Is it important to do an interview with Mr. Cayer?
Yes.
Why is that important?
Because I want to get his perspective. I want to see what he's able to tell me about what he recalls about the crime and what led up to it. If he is able to talk about that and what's happened since then. Was
there anything? First of all, you did your interview with Mr. Cayer in what format? Did you drive to the jail to see him?
I did not. It was I guess I'm not pronouncing his name properly, but I interviewed him in this same way with Zoom while he was at the Brown County Jail.
Okay. Did you have any difficulties with that? Do you feel that was not a sufficient way to interview him, or do you feel it was appropriate?
No, I actually thought it went very well. The jail was very helpful, in part because the district attorney was very helpful.
And you say in jail because, of course, Mr. Cayer has been in custody, as far as you know, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So you did the jail made arrangements for you to do a video interview with him.
Exactly.
And I guess we'll just get this out there. Did Mr. Cayer express any opinion on NGI with you?
He made clear throughout the interview, as he has in pretty much all of his interviews, that he does not believe he has a mental illness.
Okay, does he want to be found NGI?
I don't believe so. You know, it's not clear exactly what he wants. I think he wanted to be found innocent. I don't, you know, he makes a case that he didn't commit the crime and that he doesn't have a mental illness. And no, I don't think he wanted to be found NGI.
Was he accepting of his mental health struggles when you discussed that with him?
You mean, did he have insight that he had a mental health problem?
Insight would have been a better word. Does he have insight?
No, he does not. His belief is that the only mental illness that he has is Tourette's, which he had as a child, and that medication that he's being administered is completely inappropriate and only causes problems.
You said medication he's being administered. Are you referring to current medication you're aware of him taking?
Medication he was taking at the time I interviewed him in particular, yes.
Okay. Doesn't agree with that?
He does not believe that the medication is appropriate.
What medication was he taking?
So he had been in Mendota to be treated for competency, and they had started an antipsychotic medicine, risperidone.
And then he was transferred to the jail after that?
Correct.
Okay, well, let's unpack that a little bit and just walk through how that process unfolds, okay?
Sure.
As part of your review in this case, did you have a chance to examine any competency reports?
I did.
How many?
I believe 6.
And would it be fair to say that these reports were prepared at various stages of this case or different periods of time?
That's right. The first one was within a month or so of the crime, and the last one was in November of last year. And then actually, since I wrote my report, I had the opportunity to review the most recent Mendota hospitalization, where he was evaluated again by several different psychiatrists.
Let's start with the first. Let's just start at the beginning. Who is Dr. Elliot Lee?
So Dr. Lee is a psychiatrist who trained in the forensic psychiatry program and is now a practicing psychiatrist at Mendota and doing primarily forensic evaluations.
You just said trained in the program. What program are you referring to, and did you ever play any role in that program?
Yeah, so actually I think I misspoke. So I did. So there is a program at the Medical College of Wisconsin that is between the Medical College of Wisconsin and the Mendota Mental Health Institute. And while I was medical director, I started that program with a professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin, a psychiatrist there. And that has continued, and they continued. It's actually based more at Mendota now than at the Medical College, and Dr. Lee's very involved with it. But actually, I think he did his forensic psychiatry fellowship at a different program.
Okay.
But he's very involved in teaching in that program now.
Okay, so you started a fellowship, a training program between the Medical College and Mendota for people who want to become psychiatrists.
Well, who have completed psychiatry residencies, but they want to become forensic psychiatrists.
Okay, and forensic psychiatry being the application of psychiatric principles to the corpus.
Essentially.
Let's go back to Dr. Lee's. Dr. Lee is a psychiatrist?
He is.
What was Dr. Lee's role in this case?
He was evaluating Mr. Cayer for competency while he was a patient at Mendota.
Now, it looks like that report, you've had a chance to review it, you said, right?
He did.
Is Dr. Lee a respected psychiatrist?
Very much so.
And how was he brought into this case, if you're aware?
I don't know for sure, but I can speculate that he is a psychiatrist in maximum security at Mendota, and that's what he does, our competency evaluations primarily. So I'm quite sure that Mr. Cayer was sent to Mendota specifically to be evaluated for competency, and Dr. Lee was the psychiatrist who was on the unit and who did the evaluation.
Was this report contemporaneous with the crime? In other words, was it in close proximity to when Mr. Cayer committed these crimes?
Yes, it was about a month following the crime.
From a psychiatric perspective, is it helpful to have a forensic psychiatric reports so close in time to the incident?
It's unusual, but it's in a case where one is being asked to evaluate not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, where I'm really asked to evaluate what his condition was, what Mr. Cayer's condition was at the time of the crime. It's extremely helpful to have a thoughtful evaluation that was done close to the crime.
Now, you said competency, so this particular report by Dr. Lee would fare to be called a competency report.
Correct.
Addressed to a judge who was involved in the case at that time.
Exactly.
And that report, does that report focus on because it's a competency report, does the doctor focus on mental health issues?
Yes.
And did you read the conclusions that were reached by Dr. Lee?
I did.
And you said this was a thorough report, in your opinion?
It was the purpose was for competency, so it was a very thorough competency evaluation.
Did Dr. Lee reach any conclusions at that time about Mr. Cayer's competency?
He did.
What were his conclusions?
His conclusion was that he was not competent to stand trial.
In that report, there was some interview with Mr. Cayer where he was explaining something about liquid cloud messages. You remember seeing that?
I do.
In that there was a 3-hour video document that needed to be studied to understand his innocence?
Correct.
How would you describe Mr. Cayer's behavior at this time when he was being interviewed as is characterized in the report?
So his thinking was very disorganized and pressured, which is to say he was speaking rapidly and he felt the pressure to get words out, and he was very disorganized, which is to say the words didn't come in sort of logical organization and were very hard to follow. And he appeared restless, emotionally labile up and down. And Dr. Lee felt he was psychotic and thought most likely that he was manic.
So a psychotic diagnosis was identified very early on?
Correct.
What does it mean to be psychotic?
So usually what it means is somebody's having either hallucinations, which are false sensory perceptions and can involve any sensation. They can be visual, you're seeing things. They can be auditory, you're hearing things. They can also be tactile, so you feel like you're touching or feel like you're smelling or tasting. But most commonly they're visual or auditory. Or somebody's experiencing delusions, and delusions are fixed false beliefs. And then a third part of being psychotic is that often thinking is disorganized.
And with Mr. Cayer, he certainly has delusions, you would agree?
He had both delusions and disorganized thinking.
Are you familiar with a treatise called the DSM?
I am.
What is the DSM?
So it's the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists use to have a nomenclature to make a diagnosis, and it's pretty much a paint-by-numbers book. It gives you a diagnosis, and then it has a list of symptoms that one should look for in order to render that particular diagnosis.
So a doctor might think this person is psychotic. They can then go to the DSM and see if the criteria fit.
Correct, they could.
And if I understand correctly, when you talk about psychosis or psychotic diagnoses, you mentioned the hallucinations, the visual and auditory. You mentioned delusions, and you mentioned disorganized thinking as sort of 3 different categories.
Correct.
And is it fair to say that's what the DSM identifies as the criteria you should look for in deciding whether somebody is psychotic?
Correct, and it also suggests they should have a social and or occupational dysfunction.
Of course, doctors could make mistakes. Would you agree with that?
There's overlap between different diagnoses, so yes, and part of rendering a psychiatric diagnosis depends on having a period of time, so it's sometimes difficult to know what's causing a psychotic disorder without some time to see what develops. So, for example, with mania, one could be psychotic, but the primary problem is a mood disorder, and when they're not manic or depressed, people are not experiencing psychotic symptoms, as opposed to a diagnosis like schizophrenia, where people will generally remain psychotic for extended periods of time and not necessarily related to a mood disorder.
Do we want to, as a psychiatrist, is it useful to be able to look at the big picture?
Yes.
And is it helpful to have many years of time to evaluate one's condition, or is that not helpful?
So sometimes that's really important. Sometimes it's not, but often it's very helpful to have a longer time span to observe someone to get clear about what the proper diagnosis is.
One thing that I think we've all been familiar with in our own lives is the concept of somebody faking something. Are you familiar with that?
Sure. It's one of the fundamentals of a forensic evaluation where somebody may have an interest in the outcome and may try to persuade you that there's some particular thing that's wrong with them where it may not actually be accurate. So the issue of people malingering, of pretending to have symptoms or an illness, is a really important part of a forensic evaluation.
So malingering is the term that you use to describe somebody who's faking a condition, trying to fake a condition.
Exactly.
So let's unpack that a little bit. You said before that Mr. Cayer made it clear to you he doesn't want to be found NGI. Is that the impression that you got from him?
No question.
No question. So, in no question that he lacks insight into his mental illness. Do you have any question about that?
I don't.
Okay. Let me ask you whether you have any question in your mind about whether there's some malingering or faking going on here. Do you have any concern about that?
I don't.
Any concern?
Not in this particular case. No, I don't. I'm persuaded that he is not malingering.
Okay. Isn't it true? When you read Dr. Lee's report, this was the one that was done within 30 days of the stabbing, right?
Correct.
And in fact, at that time, Mr. Cayer was unfamiliar with the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, right?
Right.
Didn't know what it was.
Didn't appear to.
Okay. And this doctor went on and determined that Mr. Cayer was essentially psychotic and not competent to even stand trial.
Correct.
So you said before that something about a locked maximum, I think you said maximum security unit at Mendota. There's something called a max security.
Correct. There's several. Mendota is divided. The units are divided by level of security, so there's several maximum security units, several medium security units, and a couple of minimum security units.
So, and you knew that Dr. Lee was one of the doctors who worked on the max security unit, so there's high protection, right?
I did know that, yes.
Okay. So, as part of the competency process, does somebody get medicated or treated so that they can stand trial?
Potentially, if the belief is that medication might restore competency.
And you've had a chance in this case to study a volume of medical records from Mendota for Mr. Cayer.
I have.
Do you know whether or not Mr. Cayer needed to be medicated back in 2016 so that he could become competent?
They did try medication at that time.
And it was determined that the least restrictive setting would be a locked mental hospital for him, right?
Correct.
So that's where he continued to reside, right?
Correct.
Now, eventually, you talked about malingering. Let's talk about that a little bit. Why are you so confident that Mr. Cayer is not just faking all of this?
Well, for several reasons. Really, the most important one is that it is almost impossible to fake a thought disorder. A thought disorder is essentially someone whose speaking is disorganized, who going from point to point doesn't really follow. It's hard to understand what they're talking about because they're jumping from topic to topic, and it's not really making sense. And it is almost impossible to fake that, and to fake that for 4 years, I've never seen it. I don't believe that's really possible. And he has consistently had a thought disorder since this all began, and he still did when I met with him. And I just don't, I've never seen anyone able to fake that. So that's one issue. A second issue is that he's been tested. There are specific psychological tests that are meant to determine whether somebody is exaggerating or faking their symptoms. And he had such testing, and it showed that there was no evidence to suggest he was either exaggerating or faking his symptoms, that his symptoms appeared to be genuine. And a third issue is his ongoing assertion that he doesn't have a mental illness, that he doesn't want to either be found not competent or not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, and his trying to persuade examiners that there's really nothing wrong with him psychiatrically.
In fact, he's tried to persuade every single examiner there's nothing wrong with him, right?
Correct.
So that's been a continuous behavior throughout the 4 years that he's been incarcerated.
It has.
And the reason that cuts against malingering is because somebody who wants to be found in GI, for example, there's ways to test them to see if they're faking their condition or presenting a false impression of themselves.
So yes, that's right. And I'm not sure that I've ever seen someone who is trying to fake a mental illness who at the same time is trying to persuade examiners consistently that they don't have a mental illness.
Wouldn't make any sense.
Certainly is irrational.
As part of the delusions that you had mentioned earlier, delusions are part of so let me take a step back. We have a psychotic diagnosis very early on in this case, correct?
Correct.
And are you aware of the fact that that there had been mental health struggles even before that Dr. Lee evaluation?
So there's a little bit of information from the jail. Do you mean prior to the crime?
Yes.
So there is some evidence in the records that he was struggling for some number of months prior to the crime with irritability, that he wasn't making a lot of sense, that he didn't appear to be behaving like himself. He was having trouble holding on to jobs, holding on to relationships. And he had been apparently living in the woods for a period of time, which was not characteristic of him.
And there was, are you familiar with a USB drive that was recovered on his person in this case?
I am.
Did you read any reports that summarized the hard drive?
I did.
And what did you learn from that?
That he sort of oddly on his keychain had this USB drive, and that when the USB drive was looked at, it was just bizarre. It was the content didn't really make any sense. He was disorganized and tangential. It was hard to make sense of what it was he was trying to say. Is it?
Let's go back through the 35 or so years of experience that you've had as a psychiatrist. I'm assuming that you've had the chance to treat quite a few psychiatric patients at the Mendota Hospital in your career.
So for those 8 years I was there, yes, of course, I was primarily supervising care, but I was involved with lots of cases.
Is it the case that sometimes there's a singular event that brings someone into the mental health system, or can we usually identify somebody's psychiatric problem way before something traumatic happens?
It goes both ways. Sometimes somebody has a long history, and sometimes the event itself is the initiation of the psychiatric problem.
Meaning that sometimes you have an experience where somebody inexplicably might drown their children, for example.
So I did have a case at Mendota with a tragic case of a man who became manic and drowned his 2 children in the Mississippi River. Yes, and that was unfortunately he hadn't known he had bipolar disorder before that. If somebody has a psychotic condition, is it something that's there at birth, or can it materialize at different stages in one's life? Rarely are psychiatric illnesses notable early in people's lives during the first 10 or 12 years, and most commonly, particularly psychotic disorders and mood disorders, have their first episodes in late adolescence, early 20s, but it can be at any time. Sometimes people in their 80s can have their first episode.
And Mr. Cayer was 26 years old when he committed this crime. Would it, in your experience as a psychiatrist, do men sometimes, is that common for men to start exhibiting their psychotic symptoms in their mid-20s?
It is.
It's something that you've seen in other cases?
I have.
And it may be counterintuitive to some of us, but might a person function, just use the word normal, might a person be an otherwise fairly functional person in society and then suddenly have a psychotic break? Does that happen?
Commonly it does, yes. Sometimes there's a gradual deterioration, as there may have been in this case, but sometimes it can start quite abruptly.
And you use the phrase gradual deterioration. That does appear to perhaps be occurring with Mr. Cayer.
It does appear that way.
What do you base that conclusion on?
On information in the reports and in the medical records that his parents had reported that there were some months where he was deteriorating, where he wasn't himself, where he was isolating, he was withdrawing, he was struggling to function.
Part of what was concerning was delusions that Mr. Cayer was exhibiting leading up to this crime.
Yes, perhaps there were. He hadn't seen a professional before this crime, but there was concern that he was becoming paranoid and angry.
Was he paranoid about some sort of we've heard something about a rape claim or something that may or may not have been made. Was he paranoid about that?
So maybe. What he told me was that in January of 2016, shortly after he was released from jail, he ran into the victim of this crime in a Walmart and had heard that while he was in jail, she had said something to his mother about Mr. Cayer sexually assaulting her. And he confronted her about that and was convinced that she wasn't going to report it, he said.
And he was going to sue her or something?
Yeah, he was convinced that if she actually brought forth charges against him, that he would have no difficulty proving that he had not committed a sexual assault. And one of the things that he told me was that one could tell from his genetic code that he would not commit a sexual assault.
Did Mr. Cayer expand on that concept with you of his genetic code?
Only to the extent he couldn't really say much more, other than his belief that you can see in certain people's genetic codes that they're not capable of committing crimes unless they're forced to defend themselves.
That's something he believes that he has, a genetic code where he would not ever be violent, right?
Correct.
But of course, there's no such concept in medicine, is there?
There is not.
There might be the opposite, where somebody's genetic code might make them act psychotically. That's fair to say?
Maybe, it's an area where we're not particularly skilled at, but there are certainly things one might learn about certain genetic illnesses.
Is it true that throughout the 4 years that have lapsed since this crime, or the more than 4 years that have lapsed, that Mr. Cayer has had regular competency evaluations based on your review?
He has.
And are you familiar with all the evaluations? Have you read them all?
I believe so.
Now, after the Dr. Lee evaluation, there was, at some point he was restored to competency at the Mendota Mental Health Center, fair to say?
Yes.
Meaning that they tried medication or education or whatever they tried?
Correct.
And then he comes back to jail and decompensates again, if you will.
Correct.
And in fact, you prepared a report in this case, didn't you, sir?
I did.
Let's put it up on the screen. We're going to just show you very quickly Exhibit 21, just so you can identify it. Or state that just stipulate, I'm sure. This is Exhibit 21. Does that look like the report you prepared?
It does.
Okay. Move Exhibits 20 and 21 while I'm at it, Judge.
State's position. Exhibit 20 and 21 will be received.
So in the first page of Exhibit 20, so Exhibit 21 is your report, is that correct?
It is.
And it's 8 pages long.
Correct.
Now, you only did one interview with Mr. Cayer. You agree with that, right?
I do.
Did you feel that, was from your perspective, was it necessary to do more interviews? Would additional interviews have been helpful?
So there are cases where it is, and there are cases where I'll do 2 or 3 or even 4 interviews. But no, in this particular case, I had so much information from back closer to the time of the crime, I felt like I had all the information I needed.
Are you said before you're not a hired gun. I suppose a hired gun would be somebody who just says he's rejects the insanity defense. But do you come into this wanting a particular outcome?
No.
You're hired by the district attorney's office. Do you, as on a personal level, does it matter to you one way or the other where this goes?
No, I don't have a stake in, my stake is in being fair and trying to figure out what I think actually happened and whether it really is a case where somebody's mental illness played a role in either preventing them from understanding right from wrong, or they were compelled to commit a crime. So no, I don't go into it with a particular objective.
How many reports would you say you've prepared or been involved in preparing in your career?
So I personally probably haven't had, in the last 30 years, haven't had a year where I haven't done at least 2 or 3, and while at Mendota, was involved with many more.
And we're talking about NGI reports specifically?
Correct.
Okay. So you've been doing them your whole career?
For about 30 years, that's right.
All right. And in this case, is part of what's helpful the fact that Mr. Cayer had ongoing interviews that were done over the years?
Yes, especially that there was a fair bit of information that was quite close to the time of the crime.
Okay. What's the breakdown on your end, sir, in terms of do you overwhelmingly find that people are NGI, or do you have any idea where you end up falling over the years?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would be guessing, but I guess I'm pretty careful not to take a case unless I think there's a legitimate question. If it is pretty clear from the presentation from the lawyer who's calling me or the judge who's calling me, and it's pretty clear that this is somebody who isn't mentally ill, I don't take those cases. Of the cases that I take, I would guess I'd probably find a few more NGI than not, but I would say it's pretty close, maybe 55-45, maybe 60-40.
Okay. So the district attorney, Mr. Lassay, gave you an overview of what was all going on here in this case before you agreed to take it.
Correct.
And in fact, you told him right at the outset that you would only take the case if you could do your interview by Zoom. Isn't that what you told him?
Well, so yeah, this case went through some changes. When he first called me in March, it wasn't so clear that I was going to restrict it to that. But once the court the court, I think initially was scheduled to hear this case in maybe April or May, and then COVID hit and everything got delayed. And then we spoke again in June. And when he called me in June, then I did say, and he said, now it's been set for August. Is there any chance you could do this quickly? And I said I would, but only if I could do it remotely.
Okay. So that was all made clear right at the outset then?
And at least the second time around, yes.
Okay, and I just want to make sure that you don't feel there was any deficits at all because you had to do that remotely versus not remotely.
No, if I thought I wasn't able to get the information I needed, I would have been very...
I didn't hear that last part. You would have what?
I would have been very clear with Mr. Lassie about that. If I felt like remote isn't working and I can't come to a fair conclusion, I would have been very clear about that.
Okay, because your goal is to reach a fair conclusion, not to just hammer some report out that's not thoughtful.
Exactly.
Okay. So in the first paragraph of your report, you talk about some of the things that you examined, sir, and you did indicate that you examined toxicology reports from the state of Wisconsin, as well as a separate report from NMS Labs. What's your understanding? Why do you care about toxicology?
Well, I think one of the questions when somebody becomes acutely psychotic is, might this be a result of intoxication with a substance?
For example, somebody could take a hallucinogen, a drug that might be a hallucinogen, and it might cause them to act psychotically.
So most commonly it would be a stimulant or a hallucinogen, but sometimes people can have psychotic experiences even following marijuana. So it's important to have a good understanding of what somebody's habits were, and to get a toxicology screen is incredibly helpful.
Are you, in fact, there were actually 2 blood draws done on Mr. Cayer immediately after this incident. You're aware of that?
I am.
And that's very helpful. Why? What did it show?
Showed that there wasn't evidence to suggest that he was intoxicated.
And meaning no drugs or alcohol that caused him to commit these crimes.
Correct. I mean, oddly, there was a positive for ketamine, but that's a drug that he was administered in the emergency room.
And to substantiate that, we provided you with the medical reports that showed that. Would you agree?
Yes.
So we can attribute the ketamine entirely to what was injected at the hospital.
Correct.
And do you have any familiarity with ketamine?
I do.
What is that drug? What does it do?
So ketamine has gotten a lot of press in the last few years because there's some question of whether it actually helps depression. But that's an off-label use. Its primary use has been as an anesthetic agent. It's used prior to full anesthesia in some hospitals, and it's sometimes used in emergency rooms. And it's sedating, and it causes a decrease in memory.
It has impact on one's memory?
A very significant impact, yes.
Mr. Cayer does have some memory issues in this case, doesn't he? Meaning from the incident.
Yeah, it's a confusing question because, yes, he doesn't acknowledge that, at least to me, he did not acknowledge that he played any role in the crime or that he can remember anything about the crime. However, it's also in part related to a delusion that he has about what actually happened. So it's a little unclear to me how much of this is a memory problem and how much of this is actually just simply his psychotic process.
He seems to still have delusions, at least as of your interview with him.
Correct.
I know you weren't here for his testimony, but did he express any thoughts to you about what happened in this case? Did he give you a version of events?
He did. Essentially what he said was that somebody committed this crime and then somehow took him and got him to the crime and covered him in blood and then left and made it appear that he was responsible for the crime.
Okay. And that appears to be a completely delusional concept.
It does.
Now, the other parts of the crime, is he able to articulate what happened, or does there appear to be a lack of memory from your discussion?
He stays quite consistent about, and in the interview it was actually hard to, I had to keep taking him off track because what he wanted to talk about were his theories of who actually committed the crime and then who's kidnapped him and brought him to the crime scene. So he claimed to really have no memory of the day of the crime, of him having anything to do with the crime itself.
Did you make it clear to Mr. Cayer what the purpose of your interview was when you were doing that with him?
I did.
That you're a doctor who's evaluating an insanity plea?
I did, and I told him that it's very important that he be truthful.
And that the focus really is to try to focus on the mental health dimensions and the interplay of that, and he's going off track and talking about theories of the crime. That's your testimony?
Correct.
Now, the ketamine was certainly in his system, and you know from the records that it was administered shortly after this crime took place, right?
Yes.
Do you attribute any of Mr. Cayer's memory issues to the fact that ketamine was administered so close in time to the incident?
It's possible. I don't think that's the primary problem, but it is certainly possible that there's some interplay with what ketamine did to his memories.
The primary problem being what?
I think the primary problem are his delusions.
Can delusions be treated?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about that. In psychiatry, how do you treat delusions?
So like all other psychotic symptoms, with antipsychotic medications.
So, as a doctor, do you start with a low dose of something and work your way up? Is it a sort of a trial and error process?
Yeah, pretty much so. You pick a medicine that you think will be most effective and likely to cause the least number of side effects, and you start low and you try to find a therapeutic dose. It can be challenging with delusions, but talk therapy, other modalities are just ineffective because these are, by definition, fixed. You can't reason with somebody who has a delusion and somehow persuade them that their delusion isn't real.
Okay, let me give you a hypothetical, if I could. A person is completely covered in blood, caught at a crime scene. It's a clear-cut case of a person being involved, and they're presented with the evidence, and they persistently give a theory that's not founded in reality. Is that an example of a delusion?
It could be.
I think what you were getting at was a fixed false belief. So, meaning, what if somebody is presented with evidence that shows that their belief isn't true? Does that fix it?
No, it starts out fixed, and so the evidence typically just persuades the person that you don't get it, that you're not making sense of what the facts are, and so they try to explain it in another way, but it doesn't change their belief.
No matter the effort and the persistence, it still doesn't change the belief.
Correct.
Okay, so we got so as a professional,
you could have a videotape of the crime scene with his face, and you could show it to him, and he would have an explanation for why that's not accurate.
Okay, so Mr. Cayer has delusions, right?
Correct.
He has delusions about the crime, but he also has delusions about other things as well. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. You also reviewed a treatment to competency evaluation performed by Dr. McGlynn. Is that something you looked at?
It is.
From January of 2017?
Correct.
So that was prepared after a period of commitment to the Mendota Maximum Security Treatment Hospital.
Correct. So he had been at Mendota for a number of months by that time.
And Cayer regained competency, if you will.
That was her opinion, yes.
And then there was, did you review a letter from Dr. Deborah Collins, sir?
I did.
Are you familiar with Dr. Collins?
I am.
How would you describe Dr. Collins' credentials?
They're excellent. She's very well respected.
Is she the director of any programs in Wisconsin?
She is of a forensic group in Milwaukee that's highly respected.
You're familiar with the Wisconsin Forensic Unit?
I am.
And you would agree that's the agency that gets appointed by courts around the state to evaluate people?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay, she's the director?
She is.
Now, what did Dr. Collins have an opportunity to examine Mr. Cayer at some point?
She did.
And she...
2019, so last year.
Okay, and she also became concerned with his mental health condition?
Correct.
In fact, she identified profound concerns that he was incompetent as recently as even 2019.
That's right.
And you've read her letter to that effect, fair to say?
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you about this phrase. Mr. Cayer's comments, despite the lack of logic and objective support for them, were essentially impenetrable to rational information. You remember reading that?
I do.
Is that an example of a fixed false belief when something is impenetrable to rational information?
It is. I think that's what she was saying, is that he has delusions.
Okay. And did you review 2 reports from Dr. Collins or just 1?
I believe I only saw 1 report from Dr. Collins.
Okay. You're not familiar with her follow-up one from a month later? That one wasn't reviewed by you, right?
Correct.
But there was, because of that, there were then more competency reports drafted. You're aware of that?
I am.
Let me ask you about, I'm not going to go through every one of them, but I want to highlight some points from these. Let me ask you about Dr. Jacqueline Landis. Do you know who that is?
I do.
It says she's a medical doctor and a jurist and a lawyer. Is that correct?
It is.
Now, Dr. Landis, she prepared a report, and you reviewed that one also, didn't you?
I did.
Do you consider her is she a highly credentialed doctor?
She is.
And you're aware that she performed an evaluation of Mr. Cayer in November of 2019?
I am.
How would you describe the quality of that report?
I thought it was excellent.
Why is it excellent?
It explains in detail what she saw, what his history was, and how she came to the conclusions that she came to.
Now, she was actually a doctor hired by the defense. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And then there was also a doctor appointed by the court, if I recall. Fair to say? Well, we had the Dr. Lee report. That was appointed by a judge at one point, right?
Correct.
And so there have been doctors that have evaluated Mr. Cayer, like yourself, who are hired by the district attorney's office, doctors like Landis, who are hired by the defense, doctors like Lee, who are appointed by the judge. There's been all those 3 types in this case.
Yeah, and that's not unusual.
Now, Dr. Landis concluded that Mr. Cayer, as recently as November of 2019, was incompetent, right?
Correct.
And she concluded that, well, she did a very comprehensive review of Mr. Cayer's medical records going back to childhood, didn't she?
He did.
So based on your review of that report, you are familiar with Mr. Cayer's, some of his struggles even in childhood, right?
That's true.
That Mr. Cayer had neuropsychological testing as far back as 2006, actually.
Correct.
And over the years, Mr. Cayer has been described with a wide swath of various mental health problems, hasn't he?
He has.
It was only, unfortunately, in recent years that the psychotic diagnosis came into existence, though, right?
Correct.
Going back to childhood, we have diagnoses like Tourette's, certain developmental disorders, things like that, right?
Obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, yes, exactly.
And are you aware, sir, that even in 2013, Mr. Cayer was prescribed Risperdal? You aware of that?
I am.
And is that an antipsychotic?
It is, although it's sometimes used in other circumstances, particularly for adolescents who are misbehaving.
So it's as recent in 2013, Mr. Cayer was being seen by a doctor who prescribed Risperdal, Concerta, Depakote, and Clonidine. Are you familiar with all those drugs?
I am.
And those are a variety of mood stabilizers and antipsychotics.
Well, Concerta is a stimulant that's used to treat ADHD. Depakote's a mood stabilizer. Risperidone, as we talked about, is an antipsychotic. And Clonidine is a drug that that's used to try to decrease sympathetic output. So it tries to sort of calm people.
So it appears that it would appear that Mr. Cayer or his family were attempting to address a variety of conditions even 3 years before this crime.
Correct.
We do know from the toxicology records that at the time this crime was committed, Mr. Cayer was unmedicated. We do know that, right?
We do.
In other words, he's off his meds entirely because there's nothing in his system.
And he is very clear that he believes those medications he was on were detrimental, not helpful, other than the stimulant.
That's one of the big problems in psychiatry, isn't it?
Insight into one's condition?
Yeah.
Yes.
In that, again, somebody gets medicated, and it's a voluntary system that we have for the most part, isn't it?
Usually.
Unless some judge has ordered a person to take medication, they're free not to if they don't want to, right?
Correct.
In fact, that specific aspect of Cayer's existence was a problem in this case because during one of his commitments to Mendota, he's refusing to take medication.
Correct. I mean, he has done his best to not take medication all along.
So when Dr. Landis did her report in November of 2019, she did diagnose a psychotic condition, didn't she?
She did. She thought he had schizophrenia.
Do you agree with the schizophrenia diagnosis?
I think he is on the schizophrenia spectrum. So schizophrenia is strictly a psychotic disorder. Then there is an illness called schizoaffective disorder, which is a mix of schizophrenia and a mood disorder. So I think he's one or the other, but it's not, in terms of treatment, it's not critical to know which. It will get clearer over time.
Yes, he's medicated.
Correct.
Is the jail a therapeutic institution in your experience?
Well, they will sometimes provide medication, but in terms of being therapeutic to somebody with a psychotic disorder, not usually, no.
Usually people have to go to one of the state facilities to really have the constant psychiatric care that they need.
Correct.
And you've been able to see that in this case. Isn't it true that Mr. Cayer has gone into hospitals, he's been medicated, he's become, it's addressed the issue, then he goes to the jail and he decompensates. Have you seen that pattern in this case?
Yes.
Now, what type of thing can Mendota do to make sure somebody's taking their medication? Do they just give the pills and hope that the person swallows them?
Excuse me, let me just take a drink for a second. So they can, so they have several options. Some of the psychiatric medicines are dissolvable. Some of them come as a liquid form. Some of them come in injections, and so they can simply sit and watch someone to make sure that they swallow the pill and don't spit it out.
Okay. Now, after you said that you reviewed Dr. Landis's report, right? We just talked about that one.
Correct.
And then you're aware that right around that time, there was another report by a Dr. Tracy Lucetta, a doctor who was hired by the district attorney's office to evaluate Mr. Cayer, right?
Yeah, I don't think I had that, however.
Okay, because your report indicates you reviewed Dr. Lucetta's November 4th report.
Yeah, so I may have. I don't recall that one.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Well, if you put in here that you reviewed it, you must have read it, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so I won't ask you questions about that if you don't have an independent memory of it today. And you also were able to view video and audio of Mr. Cayer from the time of his arrest, right?
Yes.
Do you consider the video and audio evidence to have any significance in this case?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's at the time of it's just after the arrest, so it's very contemporaneous. It's a chance to see how he looked at that time. And what's clear is that he's extremely disorganized. He's very psychotic.
Okay, what we're going to do here, this will take quite some time because we're just going to have to share the screen, Dr. Robbins. But we're going to play, I'll try one video first, okay? And you can tell me if you recognize this video and if it's something you reviewed, okay?
Sure.
See how it goes. All right. Can you hear me, Dr. Robbins?
I can.
This might be a little loud. I don't have the volume figured out, but we're going to just play a video for you quickly, okay?
That's my sister!
Don't have a name. What you see is pretty much what we got.
So he's just been like, what?
Killer.
Like,
Touch my sister.
He's on something.
Touch my sister.
That worked out surprisingly well. Were you able to see that?
It was.
Okay. And is that something you've reviewed before?
Mr. Cotton, can you turn your microphone back on?
It's on.
There it is. Thank you.
Yep. So that's going to be Defense Exhibit Video 1. We will have these submitted on a thumb drive, Your Honor, so all the videos will be on there.
It's a separate exhibit?
Yeah. video.
And so we're going to call it Exhibit 20, what number are we at?
Oh, okay, we can call it 20, what are we at, 25?
I think he has something marked out.
Madam Clerk, I've got exhibits that I'll mark. Let's put this as the video as 25.
So Exhibit 25 will be a thumb drive, and you'll have various video clips on it.
Yes.
And this is video clip 1 on that thumb drive?
Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Robbins, you've watched that video before, right?
I have.
And you heard Mr. Cayer say something about Ike in that video, didn't he?
You know, I had trouble hearing. I didn't hear him in that particular clip, but I've heard it before.
Okay, and he made a phrase, "I just killed my son." Do you remember hearing that?
I do.
You're aware from your review of the reports that, of course, he didn't have a son and did not kill his son, right?
Correct.
Is it important to know that information? Well, it is important to know that information, right?
It is.
What do you make of that as a psychiatrist, that somebody is looks like this? Do you draw any conclusions from his appearance?
Well, he certainly looks disheveled at the very least. And he looks agitated, he looks a little frightened, and he appears very disorganized in terms of the things he's saying.
As a doctor, you do want to look at somebody's physical appearance. That's relevant.
It is.
Somebody who's poorly groomed or disheveled, can be a trait of somebody who's suffering a psychotic condition.
There's certainly a window into how somebody's doing.
Okay. Somebody who's agitated and frightened, that's another important observation.
Correct.
And then do you listen to the things, you want to listen to what the person says, right?
Yes.
So those statements, for example, just don't make any sense.
Correct.
Can you... Back it up all the way. So we look at a person, we also listen to what comes out of their mouth as a psychiatrist, right?
Exactly.
Is the audio okay? Can everybody hear okay with the doctor? Okay. I'm going to walk through a number of things now. I don't know if people want to have a bathroom break or a quick break. I'd like to inquire.
We've only been on the record about an hour and a half, but ladies and gentlemen, are you okay going for a little bit longer, or does anyone need a break?
Okay, great, thank you. Dr. Robbins, I'm going to show you, let's just go through some of these video clips, okay?
Okay.
All right. So that was video 1. Now we'll do video 2.
Go ahead, man.
Dr. Robbins, can you see the screen?
I can see the screen, yes.
What do you see on the screen?
That there's people holding Mr. Cayer, and that he has on handcuffs, and that he's got some blood on his hands, and that he's got nothing over nothing on his torso.
This will be video 2, Your Honor, on the thumb drive. And does this individual on this video appear, is this the same man that you interviewed in the jail?
Yes.
All right, we're going to play this one for you now, okay?
Go ahead, man. Go.
Relax.
Go. Leave me alone.
Relax.
There's a bunch of blood on the backside of him. That might be from his victim.
Hey, watch your head. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Relax, buddy. 2, 1, 9, 1.
I think let's still be okay with it. There you go, thank you.
I would go down here more. Okay.
Why don't you kill us?
Okay, so we're
Did you see that video, sir?
I did.
And what do you make of that?
Can you make Mr. Robbins'
Sorry.
video
Yes, sorry.
larger?
Yep.
Thank you.
There we go. Did you review that for purposes of your report?
I did.
Was that video significant to you?
Yes.
Why?
Because you can see that he's very agitated. He looks frightened. He appears that he's having a lot of difficulty making sense of what's going on. Presumably, he's been agitated given how they're treating him.
Let me just interject a question about ketamine. When ketamine is administered to a person, can it have a calming effect on them?
Yes.
Okay, so does Mr. Cayer appear to be medicated in any sense when you're looking at these videos?
He doesn't.
Okay. You did see videos later on where Mr. Cayer is much more calm, right?
I did, yes.
Okay. After the ketamine was administered.
Exactly.
I'm going to show you video 3. This will be a short one, okay? Can you see the video on the screen?
I can.
And it appears that somebody is holding Mr. Cayer's underpants off to the side with red or blood in there, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, cut those. Yeah, it's not from him.
You hear Mr. Cayer say, "Let go of my sister" there?
I couldn't hear it, but I heard it when I listened to it initially.
Do you need to expand on this video at all, or is this sort of in the same vein as the other ones?
I think it's very similar.
This would be 4 then. Exhibit 4. Did you see that video?
You did.
And in your clinical experience, have you seen similar cases like this where somebody appears this way?
I have.
Can you make any initial diagnoses when you see somebody in that condition?
Well, not a specific diagnosis, but what it tells you, what it appears is that he's agitated, he's frightened, he's saying things that don't make any sense. He appears to be psychotic, somewhat disoriented, and one would wonder, does he have a serious psychiatric illness? Does he have a delirium, which is some kind of acute medical problem? Is he responding to some substance that he's taken? I guess those are the things one starts to consider.
Okay, I'll show you video 5 now, sir. Can you see that?
Yeah.
All right.
You got the abrasion of that one on the side? He's got a cut on this hand.
You saw that one too, didn't you?
I did.
Comments, I don't know if you've heard the comments before when you watch those videos, fucking rapist or fucking raped my sister. You remember hearing those comments?
I do.
Once you reviewed the discovery, did those comments make more sense to you, that they were founded in reality?
No.
When somebody is talking like this from a psychiatric perspective, does it raise concerns about their mental health?
Of course. I mean, that's on the list of differentials that one needs to consider when trying to make sense of why he's so disturbed.
Of course, if you learn that there's some truth to it, that changes the conclusion. But when you learn that there's no, sister that was raped, and he does using the word rape, do you make anything from that? Are you able to? You're aware there was no filed rape charges against Mr. Cayer. Are you aware of that?
I am.
There was no pending case for rape or anything like that, right?
Correct.
You aware of any police reports for rape or anything like that?
Not.
Okay. Let's look at video 6.
Right?
This video is 5 minutes 49 seconds. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's play this.
Right? Who are you looking for? Hey. What's your name? Tell us what your name is. Okay. Hey, open your eyes. Hey.
What?
Yeah, it's okay.
The fuck? What the?
Just relax. You what?
No, that's not you know what I mean.
Hey, can you tell us what your name is? Hey, just relax here. Relax. You're okay. Just relax. Hey, what's your name?
What the fuck? What the fuck? Oh my god, what the hell? What happened?
Yeah, what happened?
You fucking tell me.
I don't know. You tell us.
I don't fucking know.
Hey, what's your name? What's your name? So we can help you.
I plead the fifth. Get out of here.
We just want to know what your name is so we can help you. We want to know what your name is.
Just shoot me. Did I do something stupid?
Huh? Did you what?
Did I do something stupid?
Yeah. What's your name? Can you help us by that? Just tell us that to start.
You're at the hospital in the emergency
Just
department.
fucking kill me. I did something stupid.
We don't know that. What is your name so that we can treat you? Hey.
You fucking know where.
No, we don't. You were running my rescue squad.
It's on your chest.
Live life. Love.
Just tell us what your name is. We're just trying to help you. You're in the What hurts?
What's hurting you?
You gotta help talk to us here.
What? Your what?
Huh.
Your neck hurts?
Your neck hurts?
Don't leave.
Don't twist it like that.
Don't leave. What the fuck? Why?
What? Just relax.
You're my son. You're my son.
Just relax. You're okay.
It's like, it's like,
You open your eyes? Open your eyes for us. Well, they're point out ketamine stuff. And before they were flipping. We were like, tracking back and forth.
Sir, did you see that?
Good.
You heard that. I have a few questions about that video. At 5 minutes and 35 seconds, one of the nurses is heard in the background saying the word ketamine, and it looks to me like Cayer becomes sedated. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Did it appear to you, from your experience, that a ketamine dose had been administered to him around that time?
Looks likely.
Would that make sense based on what you heard and how he looked?
Yeah, he looks, as you say, he looks sedated.
Okay. Now, you were watching that video as it was played, fair to say?
Yes.
And it looked, did it look to you like Mr. Cayer's eyes, when they opened up, were all white?
They did. It did.
Where you could not even see a pupil?
Agreed.
What is that? What do you make of that?
I'm assuming that's a result of the ketamine. It's a little unusual, but substance intoxication is one of the things you should think about, or certainly ketamine could do that.
So his eyes almost appear to have rolled back into his head, fair to say?
They do.
Is that something that you've seen from psychotic conditions producing that effect on people?
Sometimes when people are just incredibly frightened.
So it's certainly possible that Mr. Cayer was in such a psychotic condition or so incredibly frightened that his eyes were rolling back.
It's possible.
Did he appear to be oriented?
No, not really in any of these tapes did he appear oriented.
Okay. I'll play the last one, which is video 7. I didn't play this yet. Dr. Robbins, in that last video, you heard Mr. Cayer make the remark, "My son, where's Ike?" You remember that?
I do.
And we'll go through it in a little bit, but some officers have documented gibberish and other such statements coming out of Mr. Cayer's mouth. Is that something that is significant from a psychiatric perspective?
It is. He's confused, disorganized, frightened, not able to speak coherently.
Let's play this video now. It's about 5 minutes long.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. It's all.
Do we need any other pictures or anything of that, or can I clean that up? Of the dog? I'm good with that.
Maybe we can just use a man who doesn't have a blood all over, get some washcloth or soap. Yeah, just relax. Just relax.
You have eyes on you.
I have who?
You have my son, you bastard.
Where's your son?
You fucking killed him. I'm trying to stop you. I'm trying to stop you.
Okay. Just this pregnant. You're okay. That's right.
Almost done. Almost done. With this too, but I don't think that'll be the dog like
Yeah. Run over this way. There you go.
What the hell?
Yeah, you're at the hospital now. You're at the emergency department.
Is that recording me?
Just relax. What's your name? Hey. What's your name? Can you tell us your name? We're trying to help you. Hey. What's your name? Can you tell us what your name is? Yeah, And it's gonna stay there for now. Hey, look at us.
Did you see that video, sir?
I did.
Okay, we can turn the lights on now. I'm done with these videos.
I actually had him off because we have
Oh, right.
Dr.
I'm
Robbins
sorry.
by video.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Robbins, as part of your evaluation, sir, you did review a report from Dr. Engen. Are you familiar with that one?
I am.
And that was a report dated September of 2019, addressed to Judge Haack, right?
Correct.
So that report was drafted pursuant to this current judge's order. Fair to say?
Yes.
Because we had a different judge's name earlier, and for whatever normal processes occur, different judges get assigned over time, right?
Right.
Now, Dr. Engen is actually part of the Wisconsin Forensic Unit, right?
Correct.
And we had talked about that unit being the one that Dr. Collins actually is the director of.
We had.
So you did review Dr. Collins' concerns, and then you reviewed the report from Dr. Engen, which is a more detailed competency analysis.
Correct.
Now, she described Mr. Cayer's assertions as, quote, convoluted and with no apparent root in reality. Would you agree with that?
I would.
That's how he appeared to you as well, even in 2020?
Correct.
She diagnoses him with a delusional disorder, persecutory type. Do you agree with that?
So I don't. I think that, I can see why she says that. I think he has schizophrenia, but I think it's a fine point. I think we all agree that she and I at least agree that he's psychotic and that these persecutory and paranoid ideas he has are psychotic.
So both of you agree that Mr. Cayer is psychotic?
Correct.
And a delusional disorder, she actually gives examples of why he's delusional, right?
He does.
Claims like his lawyers are flipping him off, for example, right? Or that he would be skilled as cross-examining witnesses, those types of things?
Correct.
And he can expose on 2020 the case and it'll help him somehow?
Correct.
So that's delusional to think that just the thought process in general is delusional, right?
Exactly. He's got disorganized thinking and delusional ideas.
Now, you had an opportunity to review a 27-page report from Detective or Sergeant Holzbach. Do you remember that?
I do.
Well, Sergeant Holzbach was an individual who documented many of the things that Mr. Cayer said throughout his time in the hospital. Fair to say?
Yes.
Are you familiar with Mr. Cayer asking whether he took a car and smashed it into somebody?
I am.
You're aware there's no car in this case, right?
Correct.
And then there's something about a manifesto that, or a treatise that Mr. Cayer had written. Is it common for people who are psychotic to have manifestos?
I wouldn't say it's common, but it happens.
Is that something you associate with a mental illness when somebody is fixated on writing a manifesto about themselves?
Not necessarily, but in this case, it makes sense that it's part of his delusions.
You have to put it you have to look at the big picture is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Living in the woods would be living in the woods, writing a manifesto, wanting things on 2020, how you look on a videotape, you look at all that stuff.
Exactly.
Certainly somebody who's living in the woods, writing a manifesto, carrying a USB drive around, all those things would signify to you something's wrong here mentally with the person, right?
It certainly could be, yes. It raises suspicions.
In other words, when somebody is engaging in a lifestyle that is so outside the norm of what most human beings engage in, that suggests that there's a mental problem.
Potentially, yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Cayer said that, was explaining to the police that if someone wants to know him, they could look at his G drive? Are you aware of those comments?
I am.
And that he would repeatedly film videos of himself connecting the dots of the universe?
I'm aware of that.
And that all of it is apparently on the internet that he's put out there for everybody to see, right?
Correct.
There was some discussion about a guy named Z. Did you ever bring that up with Mr. Cayer, or are you aware that he was talking about that?
I was aware that he was talking about it, but no, I did not bring it up.
And was there a tribe that runs the planet? Was that mentioned at some point?
In the report, yes.
What do you make of the fact that Mr. Cayer, well, let me ask it this way. When you interviewed Mr. Cayer, did he bring up any women that may or may not have been a part of his life?
He did.
Who did he bring up?
Well, in addition to the victim of this crime, the names that he brought up were Nicole and Wendy.
Even to you in 2020?
Correct.
Still talking about them?
Still talking about them, and the three women are interwoven in a way that makes it difficult to tell who he's talking about.
Do you think, in your professional opinion, that he's actually conflated all three?
It's a good question. I think he may have. He seems to be very confused at times which he's talking about. When I would ask him to try to understand who specifically he's referring to, he would go back and forth between the three of them as though it's all one person.
Does he appear to realize how nonsensical this is?
No.
Any appreciation at all that you can detect?
No, not at all.
And why on earth, Nicole and Wendy, what role, if any, could you ascertain that they play in this thing?
He expressed at times anger at at each of them, at times love for each of them, and I could rarely tell which one he was talking about because he would go back and forth, as you said, as though he's conflating them, as though they're all one person.
No, you're familiar with some of the procedural history of this case because you've studied that as well, right?
Some.
Well, you are aware that Mr. Cayer went back to Mendota in late 2019.
I am.
Proceedings were suspended, and he's sent off to the mental hospital.
Correct.
That's now his second time there, as I understand it.
Exactly.
And you've studied all those medical records, or let me ask you this, what have you studied?
So I had not had a chance to get those medical records before I issued the report, but since then, yes, I have reviewed all those medical records.
So you actually went over to Mendota after you drafted your report to review additional medical records?
I did.
Did you also review jail records?
A little bit, not a great deal, but I got a few jail records.
We gave you what we had, right?
Correct.
And why are you going to Mendota even at this point in the case after you've done your report to look at additional records? What's the point of that?
Because I thought there is still some question of what happened, because I saw him after he had been to Mendota, and I wanted to know what they saw when they first saw him, what treatments were tried, what doses were tried, how he responded, and what the various providers who were able to see him 24 hours a day, what they concluded.
You're aware that the doctors that were all brought into the case in late 2019, the one that Judge Haack appointed, the one that the state hired, the one that the defense hired, based on all those reports, Mr. Cayer was sent to Mendota. That's the reason, right?
Yeah, correct.
And actual medication orders were entered against him. Are you aware of that?
I am.
Meaning that he was not be given the choice to decline medication.
I'm aware of that.
What happened once he got to Mendota?
So they concluded that he had a psychotic disorder, and they started an antipsychotic medicine, but he wasn't cooperative with taking the antipsychotic medicine. He was, as he has been all through this case, he was clear that he doesn't believe he has a psychiatric illness and that medication is not appropriate, and he was spitting out the medication. And so they had to change formulation so that they gave him liquid antipsychotic medication, risperidone in particular. He said he was having side effects from it, so they switched him to a different antipsychotic medicine, and then in the end he said he preferred the first, and so they went back to the risperidone, and they had staff who would actually sit with him and observe him to make sure after he took it that he didn't spit it out, because he remained uncooperative.
So they put someone next to him for a half hour or so to monitor him.
Exactly.
As the director of Mendota, you're certainly, or as the former director, medical director of Mendota, you're certainly familiar with their processes, are you not?
I am.
So when somebody is committed there because they're not competent to stand trial, those people are, such as Mr. Cayer, an effort is made to medicate them to bring them up to a level where they can sit through a trial, right?
If it's felt he has an illness that would respond to medication, then yes, exactly.
Okay, I want to get this distinction clarified, though. With Mr. Cayer, it's determined there's a psychotic condition. Nobody has doubt about that, right?
Well, some of the earlier competency reports questioned that, but yes, I think as the recent reports are all consistent.
Yeah, as time went on and the evaluations continued, it's clear to the doctors at Mendota he's psychotic, right?
Correct.
Okay. And because he's psychotic, the way that they approach getting him back to competency is to give him medication, antipsychotic medication.
Correct. There really is not an alternative. There's no talk therapy. There's no other therapeutic intervention that's helpful for psychosis.
Right. This isn't a guy who just doesn't know what a judge is and we can just teach him some courses on the legal system, right?
Correct.
Okay. So the goal at Mendota to, at that stage, is it to treat him to get him to his best possible functioning level, or is the goal to get him to a competency level?
To get him to competency.
Get him to that, whatever threshold that might be, so he understands what's going on.
So that he can do the two prongs that we talked about earlier, that yes, that he's capable of understanding what's going on and assisting his attorney.
Right, assuming he continues to take his medication, right?
Correct.
Because now he goes back to the jail, as happened in this case, right?
Exactly.
So Mendota, the various psychiatrists administer medications, they raise him to that base level, and then he goes to the jail with a medication order. Fair to say?
Exactly.
And when you interacted with Mr. Cayer, did he appear to be medicated and well-functioning? Is that how you would describe him?
No.
Was not that condition, was he?
No, he's still quite psychotic. It wasn't obvious to me that he was medicated. He wasn't displaying obvious side effects, for example, and he's still quite psychotic.
And in the Brown County Jail, not here to, I know you're not an employee of the Brown County Jail, but it's certainly not a psych ward, right?
It's not.
So one can hope that he takes whatever medication he's given, or it can be watched by the guards, but the professionals at Mendota have systems in place to absolutely make sure someone takes their meds, right?
Correct.
And that's important because then the person can get healthier as time goes on.
So that, yes, it treats the psychiatric symptoms.
What would the ultimate goal be with Mr. Cayer? Let's say that he certainly he doesn't think he's NGI and he doesn't think he has a mental health condition, but assuming that he were sent to Mendota to a maximum security facility, what would the treatment professionals work on with him?
So the goal isn't for him to regain insight necessarily. The goal is for him to be less delusional. Be competent to stand trial. That's really the only goal for Mendota.
Okay, so if he's found NGI and he were to go to Mendota or go to Winnebago, the treatment professionals would be working on the mental health condition for however long that takes, right?
Correct. So the goal would be to treat his psychiatric illness to a point that when he's eventually released, that he's no longer a danger.
And of course, you're aware that some people are never released, right?
So actually, interestingly, on average, people stay longer at Mendota than they would have been in prison.
Right, because it's just a sort of permanent state of existence for a lot of people.
They're not released until professionals find them to be treated to a point where they're safe to be returned to outpatient status.
Right, and as the judge had instructed the jury, you're aware that a judge stands in the way of that too, right?
Correct. So they have a conditional release evaluation where an independent evaluator is brought in to evaluate their condition and to make a recommendation about whether they believe the illness that led to their NGI has been sufficiently treated that they're safe to be discharged.
It's a multi-layered approach, it sounds like.
Correct. So the Mendota people write a letter and an independent evaluator writes a letter to the judge.
And I think you said it's the case that on average people will spend more time at Mendota than they would have in prison, right?
On average, that's true. When they get an NGI, people think they've weaseled out of incarceration, but in fact they end up spending a long time typically at Mendota.
Right, and we're not talking a hospital like many of us might picture of our own experiences. We're talking a very secure, confined facility, right?
Correct.
Highly secure like a prison would be in the maximum ward, right?
It's very similar to a prison, you're right, other than the staff are different and the way people spend their days are different.
And the goal would be to make Mr. Cayer less violent as time goes by. Wouldn't that be the goal?
To treat his illness and, yes, and get him to a point where he's no longer a risk to become violent again.
Because what happened here was incredibly violent. Nobody would dispute that, right?
Correct.
And we'll get to your ultimate conclusions here, but the goal would be to medicate Mr. Cayer to such a level that whatever psychotic condition produced these violent tendencies would subside.
Exactly.
I really would like to take a break now to use the restroom and eat, Your Honor.
Are you finished with this witness?
No.
Well, the jury's lunch will be here in about 10 minutes. Can you wait 10 minutes?
Sure, we'll do that.
Thank
We'll
you.
move along. Dr. Evans, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Let's go through, let's talk about your ultimate conclusions in this case, okay?
Sure.
So we've talked about all the various competency reports that you've studied. And do those, when you study everything as a big picture and you look at the whole history of the case, can you draw any conclusions about Mr. Cayer over that long period of time?
Yes, he's been persistently psychotic since he's been evaluated by professionals, and his condition really hasn't changed a great deal.
There might be some concern of you evaluating him 4 years after an incident to determine if he's psychotic at the time of the incident. Is that, you would agree that can be a concern, right?
Yes.
Is it, and if I understand correctly, it's helpful to have a report like Dr. Lee's so early on?
Correct. It's very helpful to read through those initial Mendota notes, particularly Dr. Lee's report, to see what condition he was in shortly after the crime.
And you did read through those initial notes, right?
Correct.
I have two, you can't see it, but I'll just hold up a huge binder as an example. This is binder 1 of 2 of Mendota records. Can you see what I'm holding up?
I can see it.
You would agree that we're talking a mountain, really honestly, many binders of medical records that you have to examine at Mendota, right?
Correct, although it's now computerized. It's not they have a computerized medical record, so it's a little bit more efficient than paging through it.
Right, but so the jury understands what you're looking at. You're reading notes from nurses, doctors, and other people who are evaluating Mr. Cayer, right?
Exactly.
And even at that time, right after the incident, he's still arguing he's not mentally ill and he's not NGI, right?
Exactly. That has been persistent.
And in fact, I don't even think he didn't even know about NGI as an option 30 days after the offense, right?
Fair.
Okay. So it wouldn't appear that he's some sort of plan concocted here to murder people and then suggest he's NGI while at the same time fighting the NGI. It doesn't appear to be, that appears to be a baseless thought, right?
Your Honor, I'm going to
I agree with that.
leading. I've allowed a lot of leading, but I think particularly at this point when we're talking about final conclusions, that's particularly leading.
I'm going to sustain the objection for that reason and others.
Okay, so with your report, Dr. Robbins, you did your best to summarize. Did you do your best to summarize all the various things you studied?
I did, although, as I mentioned, there's a couple of things I've seen since then, but yes.
No. In your interview with Mr. Cayer, it's a little bit odd because, is it odd that he won't acknowledge he committed the crime?
It's unusual in an NGI case, yes.
Can it be that once he's medicated and less psychotic, that he would gain insight into what he did? Is that possible?
Yes,
Have you seen that happen for other people?
I have.
Have you seen people's, is it even possible that one's delusions of what their brain is telling them happened outweigh the reality of what actually happened? Has that occurred for people before?
I'm not sure I understand that question, I'm afraid.
Does it, I guess what I'm asking is, Mr. Cayer seems to lack any insight into the crime. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And does medication help improve that?
Yes, it could. It could. If it treats the delusions, it's very likely that he would have a more accurate memory of what happened.
Mr. Cayer describes a difficulty sleeping for several months prior to the crime. Is that your understanding?
It is.
He was able to provide a somewhat of a summary of his childhood and upbringing to you, wasn't he?
Yes.
Including the fact that, for various reasons, he was administered a full-time aide in school from the time starting in second grade.
Correct.
Because of various emotional and learning issues.
Yeah, well, he viewed it as unnecessary, and he viewed it as related to his Tourette's, but yes.
Right, but there was plenty of additional diagnoses beyond Tourette's, right?
Correct.
And then Mr. Cayer describes being a college-educated person, owning his own business, fairly extensive work history. Do you have any knowledge of whether any of that is true or not true?
I don't.
Does he appear to suffer from grandiosity?
Yes.
What does that mean?
That he has an inflated sense of his importance.
We might call that arrogance.
Well, it's different from arrogance in that in his case it's related to his psychosis, so it's not so much a personality trait as a part of his illness.
Okay, so because he has these mental health problems, grandiosity is one of the things we see from that?
Correct.
And then you already said that Mr. Cayer brought up Nicole, Wendy, and Sabrina.
Correct.
Now, during his interview with you, did he acknowledge Tourette's as a diagnosis?
He did.
But then was confident he did not have a psychiatric illness other than that?
He said he might have ADHD, but that was it.
Okay. He's denying any history of mood problems, anxiety issues, or psychotic symptoms?
Exactly.
Yet he also discussed his genetic code, right?
Correct. It's a genetic code that would clarify that he couldn't possibly have committed such a crime.
And you reached conclusions in your report, didn't you?
It
Were you careful when drafting this report?
was.
Let's walk through your conclusions. What were your conclusions?
That, first of all, he has either schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. as his primary diagnoses.
Let me stop you there. Are schizophrenia or you said schizoaffective disorder, are those mental illnesses?
They are. They're psychotic disorders.
Each one of those is a psychotic disorder.
Correct. They're cousins. The only difference is that with schizoaffective disorder, there's a significant mood component because he has this sort of mania that he has shown the grandiosity, the pressured speech, the tangentiality. That's all typically part of a manic episode, and that's why I considered schizoaffective disorder as well.
Are you the only doctor to diagnose psychotic disorder or schizophrenia?
No.
How many others have diagnosed that?
Well, Dr. Landis diagnosed that at his recent Mendota admission, where he was started on the risperidone. They ended up diagnosing him with a psychotic disorder, but one of the things they considered was schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder.
Okay, so it seems very evident that there's a mental illness or a psychotic condition, right?
Correct.
What else did you conclude?
I concluded that I went through the symptoms that I think he was experiencing at the time of his crime. I went through the symptoms that he was demonstrating at the time of previous evaluations to make the case that these symptoms have been reasonably consistent over these 4 years since the crime, and explained why I believe personality disorder does not clarify what led to his criminal conduct. That while he may have a personality disorder, that's in my view a less important feature than the psychotic disorder. And I made the case that I don't see any evidence of malingering. Okay. My second conclusion.
Personality disorder, if I could just use layman's terms, like meaning that somebody is just difficult to get along with.
So there's a number of different personality disorders, and they vary, but essentially that somebody has a personality style that creates occupational or social difficulties for them.
Okay, so it's very possible what you're saying is that Mr. Cayer does have a personality disorder, but that's less significant than the schizophrenia.
Certainly in terms of this crime, yes.
And we know, can we be confident that there is schizophrenia based on any medications that were administered?
So he's being treated with antipsychotic medication, and he has been somewhat better. As disturbed as he still is, it's significantly better than he was before he was started on antipsychotic medicine, and I think that helps confirm that he does have a psychotic disorder. It doesn't necessarily mean it's schizophrenia.
Okay.
But it does help make clear that he does have a psychotic disorder.
Because the medications at Mendota made him better.
Correct.
And then beyond that, did you reach any conclusions about the interrelationship between the psychotic condition and the crime that he committed?
Yes, I suggested that it's my opinion that he is in fact NGI. At the time of the crime, he was so impaired that he couldn't conform his behavior to the requirements of the law, and that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong.
So there's really two prongs to the NGI question, right?
Right, and it doesn't need to be both. It needs to be one or the other, or both.
Okay, and do you take a position on, does it just seem to you to globally fit all of it, or are you taking a stronger position on one versus the other?
So it's really a complete case, as you said, because he's not acknowledging that he committed a crime, and he's not laying out very much information about the crime because he claims not to remember it, and we have limited information about what led to this crime.
Right.
I think it's clear that he couldn't conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, and I think it's very unlikely that he was able to distinguish right from wrong.
Do you believe that he was motivated by any paranoid delusions or disorganized thinking?
I do.
And is your opinion, again, you've done reports like this every year of your career, fair to say?
fair to say.
Do you reach your conclusion to any degree of medical or professional certainty?
I do, to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, yes.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think now we'll break for lunch and then return for cross-examination of Dr. Robbins. Let's take an hour, ladies and gentlemen. Lunch is ordered for you. It's here. We'll come back about 10 to 2 then. You're reminded not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else, or to do any research on your own. Please stand for the jury. Please be seated. Is there anything we need to put on the record before we take our lunch break?
No.
All right, we'll see you back just before 1:50.
Did you hear that, Ken?
150, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to talk at all?
See you then.
Okay, do you want to talk in the meantime?
No, you're in the middle of your testimony, so we'll just leave it alone.
Okay.
Thank you.